Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And this week, I want to share with you a conversation from a recent AOP Live that I hosted, titled Connected Planning for Financial Outcomes and Sustainability. In this session, we focused on aligning with the CFO office as part of their financial planning process, with a particular focus on non-traditional measures such as sustainability. I was joined by three guests who shared examples from their experience on how we can connect sustainability with financial planning, including the metrics that we should start to track. And our guests were Adrian de Groot-Ruiz, the Executive Director at the Impact Institute, Nick Wimblemuhl, the Senior Director of Capabilities and Continuous Improvement at Anheuser-Busch, and Brian Baum, Head of Supply Chain Solutions, Sourcing and Procurement at Anaplan. And for today's episode, you can find a downloadable ebook of the main points that we discussed just by going to the show notes page at artofprocurement.com/podcast. Okay, then let's go into the episode, and I kick things off by asking Brian if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
I think procurement finds all of us at some point in our lives, right? Whether we're buying a car or buying a home, a gift for someone that we care about, we all think about the right practical decisions in sourcing and procuring things. But for me personally, I started my procurement career well over 20 years ago working for my dad's construction business, buying lumber and materials to run his company. And while I did not go down that line of work, I've enjoyed working at healthcare companies and banks, oil and gas firms, and have really enjoyed working in the technology sector for a number of different tech companies over the years. But one thing that's true across all of those experiences and companies is that they all have rich procurement organizations, whether that's indirect, direct. Every company has someone that's buying materials to help drive that company's success.
Mm-hmm. Is it interesting how you find yourself buying things you would never have envisaged buying as well? You know, the vast range of things. Who would have thought you would be a lumber buyer, for example? Yeah.
And really that's what's so great about the procurement career and getting into these different organizations. Once you learn the practical facets of sourcing and procurement, you can apply those skills into different industries, whether that's materials, services, something else. But I wish more universities had programs to teach people about the diverse opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. It seems that it is improving, but I think we've got a long way to go. I think The vast majority of people that I asked that question to, definitely, myself included, fell into procurement as opposed to pursuing it.
That's right.
Nick, I want to ask, Adrian, I'm going to ask you first before I come to you, Nick. Adrian, I talked a little bit about your role, the Impact Institute, and there's a real focus that you have on sustainability. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what you do at Impact Institute and kind of what your mission is. That'll help give context for the rest of the conversation.
Sure, happy to do so, Philip. So at Impact Institute, we help businesses to measure, report, and manage their impact on society. And our vision is that all the daily work that we do, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, works to create a better world. And we see the key that helping businesses to create shareholder value by creating value to society. So to enlarge the pie, and by enlarging the pie, also creating a very healthy profit for their shareholders. And to do so, you need to manage your impact. As a business, you have many negative impacts like climate, but also biodiversity, if you look about human rights, but also many positive impacts, like you create jobs, you create healthy products possibly, you create quality of life for your end customers. And what we do is that we measure all those impacts and we convert them all into dollar terms. Mm-hmm. So what is the climate impact in dollar terms, the biodiversity impact, and what are the health benefits? And then help that again to see what of that societal dollars can be converted to dollars to your shareholders. So that's what we do at Impact Institute. And to make it also very practical, we also have a true price initiative where we help stores so that a consumer can go into a store and then can see what is actually the true price of this product, and then can work with the suppliers of those stores to make the products fully sustainable.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm really looking forward to going into some of that in more detail, because one of the missing links, and that's what we're going to talk about somewhat today, is we have all these initiatives that are value levers for procurement that go beyond, the traditional way of capturing value for procurement. And so how to think about ROI and to help our businesses understand ROI in some of these initiatives, including sustainability, where it may be a little bit more nuanced than price A versus price B, which is obviously what we've used traditionally within procurement. Nick, I do want to ask you and come to you just for a little bit of context on your role as well. I introduced your job title, and there was quite a few things within what you do, and I was a bush. One of those was continuous improvement. I just wonder if you could share a little bit about kind of where your focus is in that respect.
Yeah, with a name like Wingbermuley, then I have to have a title to match that length, right? It takes a long time. Yeah, exactly. Get the money's worth on that printing. For us, continuous improvement, it starts with understanding what are the key items that we want to continuously improve. Yeah. And there's two kind of pillars of that. How we look at it, there's sort of the customer experience side. So how are people interacting with procurement? How can we make that useful? How can we minimize the friction so that people come away from working with us and saying, like, I love working with those guys. They're great to do it, and we help enable our teams to have that experience with their stakeholders. And then the other kind of side of continuous improvement for us is a lot around data and analytics. And that's where a lot of some of the connected planning initiatives come into play. And how can we leverage this robust data set that continues to be generated all across the company so that we can manage it in a streamlined way and generate value for our organization. So those are the two areas that we focus on. And for me, it's a really refreshing role to be in, because I love the fact that we get to say in both of those areas, we're never done. We're always going to find opportunities. You're never reaching the mountaintop on customer experience and data and analytics. So it's been a very exciting spot for me to be in.
I love that focus, in both areas, but what stands out as something new to me is the focus on customer experience. Customer experience is something we've talked a lot about actually across our platforms and Art of Procurement this year, and how important that is ultimately to the future of procurement. And it's something that a lot of organizations perhaps haven't put that focus on that they've had, that they could have done in the past. Is customer experience a new initiative for you, or is that something that's really been embedded in procurement, over a longer period of time?
Yeah, I'd say it's relatively new. We really kicked off some of these key initiatives in like 2018, and since then it's ramped up. I'd say our focus on it is higher now than it's ever been from the North America procurement team perspective. And our team, we go and tell them, you have frictions with your interactions with other stakeholders. You say, man, if I could get them to help me do this, I could unlock so much value. So let's make sure we're always keeping that same thing in mind as we go work with our counterparts. Let's make it as easy for them as we can, and let them go do the best job they can and not get stuck in friction with us. So it's definitely been a mindset shift on how we've been working over the past few years that we're still undergoing. But yeah, I'm very excited for the road we're taking and how we can continue to evolve in that area.
No, I'm really encouraged to hear that that's somewhere that you're putting a lot of focus on. I see that as one of those areas that really drive the perception of procurement, and ultimately it's the perception of procurement that drives how an organization looks at us and the role that we can play within their businesses. And if they always have challenges, then they probably look at us as somebody who is a roadblock rather than an enabler for them.
Yep, 100%. We just had a survey go out. We had 700 of our colleagues here in North America give us feedback, and there's certainly some people that feel that way about us right now, and a lot of people that understand the value that we provide. So how can we make sure that everybody is understanding the value we can provide as an organization, and how can we make sure that if they are having that bad experience, what are the resources they're missing out on? Because we do know there's a lot of value that we're getting and a lot of people that do experience that.
Well, in today's webinar, we're going to talk more about that stakeholder relationship and how we bring a lot of the finance teams, closer to procurement and create more of a collaborative environment and relationship between those two sides. And we really framed the conversation around this idea of connected planning. Brian, I just want to come to you and ask if you could explain what is connected planning? Like, what do we mean when we use that terminology?
Yeah, at Anaplan, we really view connected planning as joining people, data, and plans together to accelerate business. And Nick was kind of alluding to some of that. We really want to democratize the ability to look at information across so many different facets, right? So if a group is hoarding data or it isn't sharing it with the right parts of the organization, there may be lost insights, lost value, lost cost savings when they go out to pick suppliers, allocate procurements, do other purchasing. So our connected planning vision at Anaplan is really to have enable data analysis, what if scenario modeling across all groups that are enjoined inside of a sourcing process. And it's an example that Nick was giving with that survey. That could be finance stakeholders, that could be operational stakeholders, that even pushes out of the boundaries of a company to their suppliers, their co-manufacturers, their trading partners, their logistics partners. In 2022 and beyond, everyone's realized that data is so critical, even data outside the company's walls, right? So we really look at connecting all of that information to give insights and to drive better decision making for a company. And what we're talking about today is a great example, right? Sustainability planning, ESG. You need data from all facets of operations. That could be from the utility providers that are supporting you, your shipping and freight organizations, the factories that you're working with. That's a great example of connecting the planning across so many groups to say we have goals and initiatives. We need to assemble and aggregate the data from all of those points in order to understand how our company's performing and how we might do better. So overall connected planning really started with the focus around financial outcomes. How do we drive FP&A? How do we drive OpEx and CapEx? But then that spills out into sourcing and procurement for what companies should I be working with, whether that's materials or IT equipment for indirects or services for contingent labor or advisory labor, and now into a lot of these different social programs, environmental programs, and the sustainability planning that we're helping companies with.
And so I'm going to ask, I'm going to kind of go around the table with this question, but Brian, I'm going to start with you because at Anaplan, you talked about financial planning and how that's really part of the backbone of who you are as an organization is supporting financial planning. So you're always in conversations with the CFOs of organizations of all sizes, really. What are you hearing? Because I think this is something that we as procurement don't necessarily get insight into. What's important to a CFO right now?
Yeah, so many factors. Obviously, the traditional items are bottom line profitability and cash flow management and ensuring the company's viability. But I think more and more, and the topic of today's conversation is this focus on sustainability. Consumers are voting with their wallets on what companies they want to do business with based on how they view the environment, what are their social programs, what are their initiatives to help have sustainability within the products that they're selling. Companies are looking, their shareholders and their board of directors are looking for the sustainability outcomes. What are their ESG commitments or carbon neutrality commitments that the companies are making? And we're even seeing now in employee advocacy, right? So employees picking employers that are aligned with their social and moral goals. Who do you want to work for as an employee? You have optionality, you have choice. So smart CFOs and leaders of these organizations are really having to address on all fronts, their consumers, their employees, their boards, to say, how are we looking out at what are we doing with our social programs, whether that's environmental, whether that's social, whether that's the governance programs and equality within their own employee or board of directors. And this really permeates down from that C-suite, from CFOs, into programs like the ones Nick is managing and looking at how can we contribute out to achieving the goals that they're setting up for those sustainability programs. And more importantly, these can't be a 5 to 10 year initiative, right? Companies are saying, how do we have a strategy and track that out in the next quarter, in the next year, so we can demonstrate progress to the people that we're trying to respond to, whether those are employees or consumers or something else. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
No, I was going to say, Adrian, I'm not sure if you were looking to jump in there. I was going to come to you, but in a second, but I will actually come to you right now. Are you seeing, one, I'd love you if you've got anything to kind of add on to what Brian just said there, but kind of a follow-up as well is, you talked in the beginning about one of the roles that you play is in helping kind of monetize sustainability in terms of a dollar effect so folks can understand an ROI. Are you seeing that pull come from finance, or are you seeing that pull come from other areas of the business who are trying to make the case to finance of what the ROI of kind of traditionally thought of non-financial initiatives are?
Yeah, well, we see both. I would mainly see that it comes from the CFO column that is looking to make sense of this complete new world that is becoming more relevant, but they have difficulties kind of grasping it because they're used to dollar terms and now they have to deal with tons of carbon, human rights, and they're looking how to make sense of all that data. So that is one of the main pushes that we see. And what we see there is that they feel that they lack the meaningful data to make decisions. And if you're if you're an executive, a CFO or CEO, that makes you quite uncomfortable because you're not in control. You get asked all these questions that you don't have the answer, whereas you're used to be able to say, okay, my EBIT is this, and for next quarter I expect that, and now you're in the dark. And to a certain degree, it is the lack of data that is not just there, but also that they don't see how to make sense of that. And interestingly, there is a push from also shareholders to link part of the executive pay to ESG performance as an indicator of long-term financial success. So that also makes them that they want to get a grip to that. And what they also see is that there's kind of a disconnect between bottom-up initiatives at the company and how that data is used and the data they have at their level, which typically is very, too high level to steer in their company. Mm-hmm. So what we do is to help based on the normal profit and loss, and then expand that, what we call an integrated profit and loss, so that you see all your environmental and social impacts in a P&L term, so that you can see for which stakeholders, how much value are you creating, but also just for your shareholders, the environmental impact that you have, what translates back to your shareholder value. And if you think, and that is why for us the connected planning part is so important, you need a lot of different information. You need to go through your entire supply chain, different types of capitals, social capital, natural capital, the different stakeholders. How do your employees react to that? How do your suppliers, different regions? And you see that you really need to connect all these different types of information. And many traditional tools that companies have are not fit for that. Mm-hmm. So you really need more advanced connected planning solutions for that.
I'm going to do this. I want to talk a little bit more about the use of data in a little while. I just want to hold it there because I want to come to Nick, but there's some interesting points around proactive versus reactive use of data as well, which I think is important as we talk about how to actually put connected planning into practice. But Nick, Brian referenced kind of the initiatives that you're working on at Anheuser-Busch from a connected planning perspective and kind of bringing in sustainability into that. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more around kind of what some of the drivers were for focusing in sustainability and then how you're starting to map that into the other things that you talked about you're doing from a continuous improvement perspective.
Yeah, so I think sustainability fits a similar theme from a lot of the different areas that we've had in our overall connected planning journey at AB. We had a need for reporting, we had a need for data, we had a need to get it centralized so that we can make those decisions that Adrian was talking about. Everybody knew we had to get there and get that reporting so that we could track and monitor any type of initiative we were doing. So that started very nitty gritty, kind of a siloed process. Some teams working on it's not really connected to the rest of the organization. So just like we would have financial models that kind of would be in their own silo, and then maybe something tracking commodity, which would be in its own silo. And now we have a sustainability platform, which is kind of in its own silo. The journey that we're on is saying, let's kind of figure out a way to see all of these impacts coming together at once. And that's where, we've been connecting with Brian and the Anaplan team and trying to figure out how that platform can work for us. because one of the other questions you asked, Phil, is like, what's the demands coming from the C-suite?
Right.
And the demands for us are certainly like more, better, and faster. And that's the, I don't see that going away. And they want to see the financial impacts and the sustainability at one time in one spot, and they want to understand how any different initiative we're doing is going to have the financial side and the sustainability side, all those coming together. So we don't have the time anymore to say we'll get you the financial impact and then let us do another week and come back to sustainability. We have to have a platform and a way to generate all of that together, and that's what connected planning helps us with.
What are some of the data sources that you pull from to be able to do that?
For us, a lot of what we're working on now would be on the direct side, so it'd be very volume based, and then you would have from your commercial team to your production team, everybody saying, how does this volume set translate to what types of impacts, again, both financially and then environmentally. So as you would think about it, we're going to make this many cans, sell this many cans. Yeah. What are the manufacturers that they're coming from? What's the carbon footprint of that impact? How can we optimize our freight lanes for shipping that after we've produced it to get it to our wholesalers? Well, there's a logistics cost of that, and there's a carbon cost of that based on the carbon efficiency of the footprint. So that's how those two types of things blend together, and being able to see those outputs for the same scenario, both on that sustainability side and the financial side, is where we want to get to.
Interesting. So then you can start a scenario plan, but with a scenario plan, with a certain scenario, you'll get a kind of a number immediately that's going to share, well, if we do this, is the impact, the downstream impact of all these different factors, as opposed to trying to figure that all out, multiple spreadsheets, probably weeks of time,
right.
And then having to rerun the calculation every time you want to look at a different scenario.
100%. So the old way would be, hey, here's the volume set. You 4 teams go give us an answer back, and we regroup in a week. And the answers kind of don't all quite gel together. And then actually we do want to change a couple things. We noticed some things were wrong in the initial volume. So let's go back and come back in a week. And those types of things, there's so much streamlined capability and opportunity for efficiency and improvement when we can all start working off the same data set and doing it together through a larger connected planning platform.
Yeah, you can optimize so quickly in that way, as opposed to either it seeming like too big of an initiative to get your head around to actually make any traction on, just because of time prioritization. Now you can make decisions, well, with everything connected, and being able to run the numbers that you want to be able to run, you can make immediate decisions based on that.
Exactly.
The other exciting part is really taking all of that data over to someone like Adrian to do benchmarking, right? Because it's one thing for Nick's team to have all of this great data, but then what does it mean? Is it good? Is it bad? How are they compared to other similar type companies? So,
well, I want to Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but if anybody does have any questions for our panelists today, please don't be shy. Pop them as those in the question box, or send a chat message to Kelly. I do just want to ask Adrian, because it's still really on the topic of sustainability and who's driving the sustainability conversation. In Europe, I think that businesses who are based in Europe or that have a large European presence are kind of used to the regulatory environment where sustainability issues are becoming, it's not something that you can debate within your organization, whether it's something that you will do or not. It's going to be governed and mandated if it isn't already, just depending on jurisdiction. In the States, it's not so much like that. It's more of a business-to-business decision. And I just wonder if you're seeing, like in the US, whether you forecast that there will be more regulatory requirements that come in that force businesses to be more focused on sustainability, or whether it really is going to be based on ultimately top down from shareholders, as we talked about, shareholders connecting payments, to directors on sustainability initiatives. Is that the way that you're going to get more adoption in the US?
So I think you're very correct that you see that in Europe, the regulation is driving a lot, and even there, a lot of new regulation is coming in the coming 2 years, also around due diligence, where directors will also be, personally liable for certain aspects like human rights. So that's really going to have a major major impact. And in the US, you see two things. On the one hand, it will always be more shareholder driven than in Europe. And there you see that a lot of initiatives is actually coming from more a new form of capitalism. Also BlackRock, for example, really stressing sustainability. So that will be a major factor. But they are really driving that. If you look at the major asset managers, they're really asking more and more in terms of sustainability data. But also the regulation part is changing. Like SASB, that was from the SEC, they are joining up with the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standard, to come to a global view on what is sustainability reporting look like. And so that is a major shift. And we see on the plus side that a couple of states, like government at the state level, like for example, New York, they're looking how to actually in their own procurement reward more sustainable production. And that is of course an opportunity from a procurement perspective if you have that information.
Kelly, I want to come over to you and ask if we have any questions for Adrian, Nick, or Brian so far from our audience.
We do have questions that have come in, and I'm actually going through the list quickly so that I can direct one to everybody. Brian, for you first, I have a question here from Amy. You've talked about connected planning being sort of a collaboration, or there are roles for both finance and procurement in the connected planning effort. Who typically takes the lead? Is it finance leading and procurement contributing, or vice versa?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's a great question. It really depends on the scenario. We've got Nick here as part of a procurement organization, and they may be leading the initiatives out of their own center of excellence, leading their own transformation programs, trying to drive supplier performance improvements or whatever their focus goals are. But we see the opposite as well. We can have CFOs have their own financial transformation goals and initiatives, and they're bringing procurement or sourcing teams into those goals. So that's what's great about connected planning. It doesn't have to be inside out or outside in. Organizations can operate in both means, whoever's kind of leading the charge with a particular goal or strategy. Yeah.
Excellent.
I'll chime in there really quick, Brian, because I think we have an interesting story at AV on how we've gone on the journey. Kind of finance and procurement both did it a little bit independently. And then I actually came from the FP&A group. So joining into procurement, one of the great parts about the connected planning space is that you can start connecting those two journeys. So we brought to our CFO some opportunities to say, look, this is the opportunity we have within procurement. We can start connecting this into some finance models that probably you weren't even understanding some of the value procurement could bring to that. And now people are really excited about those opportunities. So yeah, kind of a third almost option of how those two things can come together.
A hybrid. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can stay with you, Nick, question for you. We're talking about obviously data and reporting and financial results, and procurement tends to have an inward focus. But when we start talking about sustainability, especially for somebody that works at a consumer brand, there is sort of that element of the consumer base. And like Brian mentioned earlier, employees deciding what types of companies they want to go work for based on their own values. How would you say it changes the work that you and your team do around both financial results and accountability, given that you do work for a consumer-facing brand?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing you mentioned there, Kelly, was around employees coming in. So we talked about the continuous improvement part of my role. The other part is capabilities, and within capabilities, we are the primary recruiting function for our team, and definitely the amount of interest that our incoming prospective employees have in sustainability is huge. So that's definitely a part of it. And then if you can maybe help me get to that second part of the question there, Kelly. There was a lot inside of there.
Sure. So some procurement folks are only focused on indirect spend, right? And so regardless of what their company does, the consumers aren't necessarily going to be aware of their work. but working at AB InBev with a whole series of very well-known consumer brands, and as you had mentioned, working on direct spend, is there an impact that the consumer perspective, the end consumer versus your internal customers, has on the way that you approach, let's say, just to narrow it down a little bit, maybe even how you think about your reporting around sustainability? Because some of that could potentially end up being in an outward facing report that ends up becoming visible to consumers. Do you think that impacts the way that you approach the task, or do you think, nope, we just do connected planning in a very thorough way, whether it's going to be kept internal or whether it might be in front of customers at some point?
Yeah, so I think, or one example of how I think it blends both the internal and external, is that we have 4 pillars of our 2025 sustainability goals. One of them is smart agriculture, and that's we want to have that we have the smart agriculture goal to have 100% of our farmers be highly skilled, connected, and financially empowered. We want to do that because that helps our organization with our supplier base, but that also really resonates with consumers, a lot of whom are very connected to the farming community. So there's, I think for all of our sustainability goals, there's a little bit of that. There's definitely the internal need, and then also believe it should have the positive reaction in the market.
Excellent. And Phil, I know you teased that we're going to come back around to data, so maybe I can cheat and this can function as a transition. A question for you, Adrian. This is from Wivo. He picked up on something that you said earlier, where I believe the word that you used to talk about data was meaningful. I know this is terrible for audio, so just visualize the air quotes. When data is meaningful versus being good quality data or bad quality data. In your experience, what tends to go into the perception of whether or not the data is meaningful to decision makers?
Yeah. That's a great question. That is mainly if they feel they can understand what they're seeing. Often just understanding, they see graphs and they see tables that they don't understand, especially if you talk about sustainability and bringing that information to financials. It's just different worlds. And second, having information that they can actually make a decision on. So if you're a financial, you're used to comparing ROIs or NPVs. So you have something that you can compare certain options with. And then in sustainability, often you get a bunch of metrics, so many tons of CO2. You get talked to about, for example, child labor, and then you have biodiversity, and then you have a bunch of numbers, but they don't tell you if alternative A or B is better. So you need to provide the data in a way that shows to a decision maker, is alternative A better than B and why? And that is like key in making it meaningful, because that's what data is for, to make decisions and compare alternatives.
So I want to build on that, Adrian, and ask another question about data and benchmarking. You know, how can organizations even start to begin to think about what they should be benchmarking, what good looks like when it comes to some of these sustainability initiatives?
Yeah. So and perhaps also for the perspective how important in that benchmarking also procurement is. So the first step that we advise is that businesses make a materiality assessment just to establish what are relevant impacts, because they don't know. Depending on the countries you're at, in the sector, very different impacts will be relevant. So having that materiality assessment, is climate the most important thing? Is it water? Is it biodiversity? Is it the health impact? That is key. And then we often see that 60 to 90% of the impact of a business is actually in the supply chain. So you have a part in your own operation, but the majority will be in the supply chain. And then interestingly, also, if you look at the market capitalization of firms, 60 to 90% of that, again, cannot be explained by the book value. It's in non-financial assets, reputation, social capital, intellectual capital, natural capital of the people. So that means that a lot of the value is hidden in your supply chain and in your procurement decisions. So that is where we say, well, there you want to benchmark your performance. And then, for example, so using in 2 ways, Anaplan. One is to make actually we have a global impact database that, depending on the sector, country, you can see what is the benchmark. How good are you performing in terms of, for example, human rights, or in terms of, for example, soil quality, that you can benchmark yourself to peers in your sector. That is just the first step, because then you need to see for those impacts that are material to you, that are driving societal value, that are driving shareholder value, you have to measure internally in a good degree. And for that, you really need connected planning, because you need information from different parts of the organization. And in almost all cases, you will need to work very actively with your suppliers, because you will not have that data. So you need to work with your suppliers to actually understand your impact.
And there were, I want to ask Nick, because you mentioned Adrian. I have some questions to kind of go deeper than that, but I want to ask you, Nick, because it's something we talked about. Actually, in our preparation call, you were talking about, looking at objectives like water utilization, sustainable farming, underserved community utilization. Some things you mentioned actually when you talked about smart agriculture as well. Like, when you start to have objectives like that, how does that change? Like, what's the implications for procurement in the way that procurement actually goes about doing their business?
For sure. So we actually even changed the name of our department, that we're no longer the procurement department. We're the sustainability and procurement department, because it has to be tied in. Adrian, I think you said 60% of the sustainability impact can be kind of directly tied to procurement. I think we feel like it might even be higher here at AB. So everybody has to do a sustainability type activity to get us to the goal. The pro of the Anheuser-Busch culture is that we'll set these big goals and kind of let the teams autonomously try and figure out how to get there. So we're all set the big goal, and now everybody is adding the sustainability focus to their job and their role. I mentioned on my recruiting hat, it's always one of the questions that I get is, so this is sustainability and procurement. Do I do a sustainability job for a little while and then a procurement job for a while? I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. Everybody is blended, because you can't really do one without the other. So it's brought into everybody's job. And so for even somebody like me that would say, I'm doing a lot of technology implementation. Well, how is that really sustainability? We're talking about it right now, right? The data and analytics around that is enabled by the work that I'm doing. So everybody is doing it in our department for sure.
You talked earlier about a mindset shift. That must definitely have required a mindset shift from, those traditional, you kind of mentioned before you came from an FP&A background into procurement. I've been in procurement for 20 years, and you grow up with procurement being one thing and changing and evolving to something else. I'm sure it required a lot of change on behalf of a lot of your team members who've been in and around procurement for a long time.
It did. It did require some of that mindset shift, but it was the cool part about this one versus some other change management efforts, which change management always has a lot of different difficulties that are associated with it. But people are really hungry to participate in it. It was a very exciting change. I think that our whole team got very energized by that prospect. It's a small thing that somebody may have noticed, but Budweiser on their cans has 100% renewable electricity printed on it. So, very consumer facing endeavor. And so much of the mechanics behind the scenes to make that happen was done by the procurement department. So, not only are people hungry to participate in these types of activities, but to see the impact going all the way through to how the consumer sees our product is a very energizing part of our roles.
That's something we sometimes miss, in procurement, is seeing the direct impact of the work that we do every day. And it's definitely very satisfying. I know I've been in industries like automotive, for example, where you see your work driving around and you kind of can connect what you do on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of times within procurement, we miss that. So I can see that being a real driver for folks, and being able to actually, every time they look at a can, for example, they can know, I was part of that, and how fulfilling that is. for the team. Now, I just want to jump on, kind of dig deeper to one thing that Adrian said. Adrian was talking about metrics at kind of an organizational level and benchmarking from an organization perspective. But Nick, from your perspective, as you look on a category by category basis, do you do any benchmarking or setting objectives on a category basis, or are you really just rolling it all up to an organizational level?
Yeah, there are some sort of underlying micro objectives in different categories, and for a lot of the ways that we'll do that benchmarking is that we have a global organization, so everybody's reporting their data, and there's benchmarks of who's the best across the globe and the different arenas. So there's some areas are going to have different enablers that others won't for regulatory reasons or what have you, but generally you say, okay, we know this is possible. We're seeing our own company is doing it. So how can we get everybody closer to that best in class from just our own company? And then also we're working with consultants to, similar to the one Adrian is running, to provide those third-party benchmarks as well to set the realistic goals for areas that maybe don't have as much insight into within our company just yet.
And Brian, we've talked to Nick about what Nick is doing at AB InBev, but you obviously work with a lot of organizations every day across a variety of different industries. How are you seeing some of the organizations that you work with start to take the benefits of connected planning and apply that to sustainability to drive, impact? Essentially, that's what we're all trying to do here, is drive impact. What do you see on the ground?
Yeah, and it's great to hear both Adrian and Nick's perspective, because what you have here in Adrian's organization is that advisory benchmarking capability that we need to kind of calibrate those real world decisions that a company like Anheuser-Busch is working through. And what's exciting is a platform like Anaplan is handling both sides, right? So both that internal reporting, the external reporting, and we work with oil and gas companies, we work with utilities, we work with obviously consumer goods organizations and industrial manufacturing firms. All of them, while they may be looking at sustainability through a different lens, they still need to aggregate all of this important data, not only internally, but they have to, as Nick and Adrian have pointed out, work with all of these trading partners and suppliers to help achieve their goals. Maybe 5-10 years ago, it was okay to kind of only stay inside the boundaries of your own company. But now with globalization and these new capital markets and really co-manufacturing, and in some cases, there's just a very small presence at the actual company to do marketing and branding of a product. The sustained supply chain that they're working with is where all of the ESG impacts really reside. So that's what gets exciting about Anaplan, aggregating all of this data for that internal and external reporting. The other exciting part of this is taking this data and using it to do advanced analytics and forecasting and prediction, right? Because if you're cobbling together spreadsheets, by the time you create that information, it's out of date, and you're only then refocused on creating the next report. You don't have the capacity as a human then to do higher order analyses. When you allow the software to do all of that heavy lifting for you, now you can run advanced AI and ML prediction engines to say, where do I see these greenhouse gases going? Where do I see my sustainable, renewable energy utilization going over the next several years? And that can feed into some of this benchmark analysis that Adrian would do, that could help drive some of the goals and initiatives that Nick's teams may be chasing. Ultimately, we want the software to make our lives easier and help to streamline some of those activities. So in Nick's example, the employees can work on the next generation of cool activities that gets them energized, not just cranking out spreadsheets all day long.
Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Adrian, I'm going to come to you. If I don't know if you have anything to jump on what Brian said. It looked like you may be jumping in, and I have a follow-up question as well if you don't. So let me know if there's anything you wanted to add to what Brian said there.
Yeah, what I think is exciting is that indeed, in a way, Anaplan also embodies what's driving this movement towards what I would say quite radical transparency. So 10 years ago, we just didn't have the technology to get to the level of ESG data that we have. So people were interested, but the data wasn't there. So the cost of information, that is decreasing very, very rapidly. And that means that we will have much higher level of transparency than we're seeing now. And one CEO we work with, he says it very nicely. He says, well, if we're all going to be naked, we better look good. So you have to prepare to, when this transparency hits you, that you look good, and that is not just that nice green coat that you can now put on. And if you're underlying that green coat, it doesn't look good, you have a problem. And it's really the technologies like Anaplan that is driving that. So I think that is super exciting.
You know that transparency that you talk of. Do you think that the market will ultimately demand that? So companies who may be fighting against that transparency now will be in a position where they're in an anti-competitive situation ultimately because their competitors are being transparent around their ESG data, so it's going to force the issue. Is that kind of how you see this playing out?
Yeah, definitely. And also because there's more transparency, you actually have to perform. And you sometimes saw that business, they choose to focus on one theme. You take carbon, but then if you don't look at your health impact, then that's a major problem. And so that you cannot have that pick and choose. And for example, what we from two extremes, one is kind of very regular supermarket, a very large one, Jumbo, and they said, well, based on new regulations, we just need to have a due diligence scan. Doesn't need to be precise, but for all our categories, all our products, and can we have that? And so that is on the one extreme something that you see from flowers, mangoes. What is it? And then if you think about kind of the breakdown per origin, product category, that's a lot. And then, well, of course, Nick produces a lot, but then we also work with supermarkets who produce, who sell more and more, or with banks, that invest in various ways in many different sectors. And so aggregating all that different type of data is a super interesting challenge. Another kind of example, very different company like Tony's, that's also social enterprise, but the fastest growing chocolate brand in the supermarkets here. They had a positive image, and they said, we want to have slave-free chocolate, but they got questions from consumers. What is it actually? How do you compare it to other brands? And then they actually needed to get that benchmarking. They found out that is like 50% better. But then you are going to get those questions from consumers if you're putting your brand forward like that. And then also, what are you going to do? For example, they said, we're going to pay extra to the farmers, and we're going to make that transparent. Well, that has driven a lot of sales, but that does require that you're transparent about those improvements that you claim. And so those claims about your sustainability, they're going to be scrutinized, as they can be a big value driver, but you require then your procurement people to be able to deliver that information.
Right. Yeah, and it's no longer a check the box exercise where so many of these were, we say we do something, we put it in a report, and it never gets scrutinized ever again. We talked about reactive and proactive use of data, Adrian, and so I'd love to know. We talked about benchmarking. Often benchmarking can be reactive because you're looking at a benchmark and saying, okay, I'm measuring myself against where it is. It's not necessarily driving decisions in real time. Like, what are some examples that you see of folks that procurement professionals can perhaps pick up on, where you can proactively use some of the data that you're able to provide to make decisions in real time, or to predict a future and make decisions based on those predictions?
Yeah, and also kind of to understand one of the big challenges, if you look typically, businesses use the data for their reporting, and then they may need to have assurance, and that is often quite high-level data that they can show that is valid at the highest level, but that doesn't communicate with the initiatives that happen in the field. So that what procurement does. So that means that the information you have for your day-to-day decisions doesn't match the information you have for your reporting that you're accountable of. And it's a very difficult challenge to bring that together. And only kind of a connected planning solution that combines a different source of information is able to deliver that. Because otherwise, it's not possible to get the information that is auditable, but is also sufficient granular that you can make your decisions on. For example, with a bank, ABN AMRO. So they produce it, they publish their integrated P&L, also with assurance in past years. And then they said, well, how can we link it to our IT procurement? Because they were very interested in that. And then, we did a project to bring those two very different worlds together, and also surprised how much impact there actually is in things like IT procurement that people typically don't think about that much, like the amount of tons of carbon that is needed for that. And so I think that is quite an interesting example where you see that you can actually bridge two different worlds.
Now, Kelly, I want to come to you to see if we've got just a few more minutes here. See if we've got any other questions that you've received from our audience today to pose to Adrian, Nick, or to Brian.
We do, as a matter of fact. So I have one quick question, Nick, for you, and then Adrian, another for you. Nick, I think this is probably going to be a very easy question, but if I don't ask it, my GoToWebinar chat panel is going to explode. We talked a little bit about recruiting. Do you get free beer?
We do. It's there's an old sort of drive-through that you'll pick up the beer at, and you get 2 cases a month. And I've been at AB for over 7 years now, and the thrill of getting your 2 cases never gets old. It's a treat every single time. So,
well, thank you for that. So everyone listening in, you can now stop submitting that question. I asked Nick. Now, that's why everyone's here today. But equally important, Adrian, question for you around how procurement can sort of sell or advocate for the importance of ESG internally, especially if, you've talked a little bit about supermarkets, and Nick has talked about sustainable or smart farming, where there's an obvious, very close connection to a product or a service that is related to sustainability. But if you have a procurement team that is maybe more focused on indirect spend, where especially with their first tier suppliers, there's less of an obvious way to make an impact or move the needle around sustainability, how can procurement start having those conversations internally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think it will be easy because the questions will be asked to them because this is coming. And also as the focus is a bit less from kind of policies, and until now a lot was on ESG, on policies, intentions, on actual impact, so that you can actually quantify it. And there you see that a lot of your impact is, as we talked before, also on that indirect side. And so that if you go away from policies, what can you easily influence to actually the impact, you see that that is very important. So that is getting more and more attention. And then a easy step is, can you do an analysis, for example, with more top-down databases that can show, well, actually, this is a very material part of our sustainability, and so that you can actually show the importance and the value of focusing on that. And the other is that you can help, because that's often a challenge, that people, or from sustainability, they will have sustainability information, but then from the financial side, you're asking, okay, that's nice, such an initiative, but what is the financial implication of that? Because, well, you cannot just look at the one without the other. And if you, as procurement, can be a partner, that you can actually look into that space in terms of what performs well from a sustainability perspective and from a financial perspective, you can actually be part of the solution. So I think those are two ways. One is actually making clear, visible, what is the impact of that indirect spend, and the second is being a partner to bring the financial and non-financial information together to be able to find the space where there is actually an opportunity.
Adrian, when you talk about financial, because we talked about this a few times in terms of making helping position the ROI of focusing on initiatives like this so that it is better understood by a CFO, for example. What are some of the ways, like what are some of the numbers or some of the calculations, or I'm just trying to kind of visualize what would you say to a CFO with a dollar number in front of it to say this is the impact of taking a and I'm just going to pick one at random, a greenhouse gas initiative. Like how can you turn that into dollars that a CFO would appreciate and understand?
Yeah. So, for example, with CO2, you can look at, and you do it in two steps. So the first step from a societal perspective is a ton of carbon is around $200 per ton. So if you have a million initiative that says 1 million tons of CO2 per year, then you say, well, that's around 200 million in societal value. So that's the first step. They say it's relevant from a societal perspective. But then the second step, of course, is they say, well, that's nice, but that is for a societal. And that you then see and go look from that, those 200 million, which part does translate actually to costs in the future. And there also the predictive part is very important, because where you saw that, say, 8 years ago, the actual financial cost of a ton of carbon would be around $0 to $2. Now, in certain parts of Europe, it's around 30. And so it's increased by factor 20 to 30, and it's predicted to increase even further. And so that you can actually show, okay, this will save you 30 million in actual dollars per year. But to make that claim, you need to know in which country, because what we call the internalization rate is different per country and legislature. But then you go from certain tons of carbon to actually dollar term for society, to dollar term for the company that you can integrate in your NPVs and all your other calculations. And the same thing you can do for child labor or biodiversity.
Just kind of taking that walk ultimately to something that is relevant to the specific business that is in question, that's using those benchmarks. I know it's about time to wrap up. Brian, I want to ask you one last kind of quick fire question. You're obviously, we've talked about, involved with a lot of organization who are connecting their financial planning with their sustainability goals. Any kind of tips on where to even start thinking about that? Like, where do folks start that are successful on that journey?
Yeah, I joke that the journey of 1,000 steps begins by agonizing over what shoes to put on, right? So there's amazing green technologies out there now that are helping to aggregate all of the data that Adrian's talking about and helping to drive the collaboration that Nick was alluding to. Anaplan's one of those platforms that's helping to kind of bring that next generation of data availability to organizations. So the biggest thing is just to begin that journey, and whether you want to or not, it's happening with new requirements from the SEC and other regulatory agencies. If it hasn't hit your company, it will very quickly. So don't hesitate to reach out if someone needs help.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.